for this race?
Well, look, a couple things. I think, first of all, if you look at who the commentators are who've been uber critical, I mean, you just showed Reverend Al Sharpton.
And Karl Rove.
And Karl Rove, who hates Rick Perry.
Okay.
And the Bush folks hate Rick Perry. So it is interesting to see, who the people are who are coming after him. I think this is more of a product of the modern media age than it is an anti-Rick Perry movement. I mean, nowadays the press follows every candidate, or it's not just the press, it's trackers, it's websites who weren't around 5 or 10 years ago. So the scrutiny that these candidates have, I mean, Rick Perry wants to talk about jobs. Texas has created about 1/3 of the jobs that have been created, but when he slips up, they're there, and that's what they show.
But it's not just people, it's not just commentators. This morning, as if to underscore my point, New York Times front page story about Perry raising millions of dollars from people he appointed to various state boards and commissions. Washington Post front page story about how many of the jobs you just mentioned in Texas are actually government jobs. So, Christina Bellantoni, when a lot of reporters start picking through your record, we saw this with Bush, 43, and Texas, Bill Clinton in Arkansas, it can seem kind of prosecutorial.
It can seem like that. And you asked the question about wanting to tear a candidate down. Well, first you have to build that candidate up, right? So we saw multiple stories before Perry got in about the vacuum in the Republican nomination.
And he was going to sweep in.
Exactly. So I think that these stories were all obviously being worked on for weeks in advance. Everybody sort of expected it. But it's also the media searching for, how many times have you seen Texas-sized in a headline this week? They're looking for narratives that feed into the fact that he's a cowboy from Texas. And it's just so easy to give somebody a label like that instead of actually delving into their record.
Now, some of this obviously revolves around what Perry is saying on the campaign trail, David Sirota. So on the subject of climate change, he said the other day there are a substantial amount of scientists who have manipulated data, questioning the original idea about man-made global warming. Now, should reporters, not pundits, not commentators like yourself, just report that straightforwardly, or should they say this is a bit crazy compared to the scientific consensus on climate change?
Well, I think reporters have an obligation to put it up against what science is telling us. And if there is a scientific consensus, which there is, about the fact that global climate change is happening and humans are contributing to it, reporters have an obligation to put up that science next to what Rick Perry is saying. And to your point about whether that's prosecutorial or not, what I would say is if this guy is running for president of the United States like any of the other candidates, the public has a right to know as much about his rhetoric as possible. So it is the press's obligation to be maybe not prosecutorial, but at least adversarial in trying to find out what this guy is all about.
Is any of this cultural? Is there any of this a reaction to another sexist governor with cowboy boots who drops his G's?
I do. I think so. I think, again, we talk about this every couple of weeks, I'm sure, on a media show. But, look, most of the media are folks who are, educated in elite universities, who live in places like New York or Washington, D.C.
I went to a state school, buddy.
Well, yeah, some of us. I went to college in West Virginia, but you know where I'm going. There's a cultural divide. I mean, I go to Whole Foods. Other people go to Walmart. I mean, there's a difference, and sometimes I think that is the bias that I think is more insidious than liberal bias.
Okay, I think the press needs to hold candidates accountable, of course. So, for the Wall Street Journal reported that when Perry said again the other day that farmers are being required by some federal regulation to get commercial driver's licenses to drive their tractors. Not true, according to the Journal. You used the word narrative. Could there be a narrative developing here that Perry is a guy who shoots off his mouth and mangles the facts, and then every single time he's off by 10% on something, we fire at him?
Sure, although, look at Michelle Bachmann. People give her, I say, far more heightened scrutiny to her gaffes than male candidate gaffes. I mean, that is just a fact of what's happened so far.
Is that ideological, or is that because she has also had some well-publicized missteps? I
think it could be all of the above, and in his case, he's getting a lot of scrutiny because he's so new to this. People want to see him trip up and say some sort of Texas, swaggering slang that's going to allow them to have a nice headline on this. Eventually, he's going to be a candidate just like everybody else, on the debate stage like everybody else, and he'll get equal treatment. But in this week, I mean, he's been on the front page almost every day this week.
That is true. Of course, and that's not unrelated to the fact that he has shot up in the polls. Now, on this program last week, right after the Iowa straw poll, the much hyped Iowa straw poll, I should say, Roger Simon was one of the guests and talked about how Ron Paul, who almost beat Michelle Bachmann, finished second by 150 votes, wasn't getting much attention. Jon Stewart is among those who picked up on that. Let's roll the tape.
We have a top tier. It is Mitt Romney, Rick Perry, and Michelle Bachmann.
We have a new top tier, and it's Perry, Mitt Romney, and Bachmann.
There's now a top tier
in this race, at least for now, of Romney, Perry, and Bachmann.
I mean, I think that's fair to say.
Really fair to say? You're not forgetting, I don't know, anyone, say an ideologically consistent 12-term congressman who came within less than 200 votes of winning the straw poll?
David Sirota, what explains Michelle Bachmann appearing on 5 Sunday shows the next morning and Ron Paul being shut out?
Because Ron Paul doesn't fit the narrative. And we were talking about other narratives that are embedded in our media debate country, our political debate. Ron Paul is an anti-war, pro-drug legalization, pro-civil liberties Republican. That doesn't fit into not just Republican politics. It frankly, unfortunately, doesn't really fit into much of Democratic politics either. And so he's being sort of written out of the story because he can't be put through the prism necessarily of that red versus blue summer camp color war idea that dominates so much of our politics. It's really sad because here's a guy who has had political success, who by every other metric that any candidate would be judged by would be included in as a front runner, or at least in the debate about who is going to win or could win the Republican nomination.
Yeah, I'm disagreeing with David on this. There's a couple things. You know, first off, he's not very well thought of in the polls. One of the reasons he has a national presence is because the media built him up in 2008 because we all got web traffic off of it anytime you put Ron Paul in a headline. That is one of the dirty secrets of this business, right? We built him up. Another issue here is that he's 76 years old. And I think that if this were a 55-year-old candidate who was making all of, you know, this platform, having this sort of liberal Republican platform on a lot of social issues, he would have a much better chance of getting
it's not, look, I think Ron Paul gets the press he deserves. Because number one, it's not like we haven't been down this road before. He's run for president a couple times. He wins straw polls or performs well in them. He raises a lot of money.
But that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy if you decide in advance that he's not going to win the nomination.
Well, the other thing, though, is he is, again, the last time that Republicans had a foreign policy like Ron Paul's, it was Tom Dewey. He is out of touch with the Republican mainstream foreign